So growing up down there. So yes, I do know Manhattan. I've actually been there. My brother's in-laws live there. So is that where you got your start? And, before we can talk about where you're going, we should discuss where you've been. So you were part of the Chicago Celtic punk band, Flatfoot 56. Did that all get started down there?
Yes. So I actually, my start to music really came from church. I grew up my parents, for context, my parents grew up Mennonite. That was kind of how, and they were Mennonite all the way back before they even came over, over the pond. And so when I was born, my parents they kind of had switched gears and started going to a non-denominational, I would say like a prosperity gospel Pentecostal type of church. So I kind of grew up in a big mega church, but my musical journey kind of started there with like the 4-part harmony, really beautiful hymns of Mennonite tradition, and then playing with a whole lot of gospel players. Really, like a really wonderful thing about that was that I ended up playing with a lot of really interesting people. A lot of my intro to music there was, I would say, 3 main people that I gleaned from. And the first one was this old Black woman. Her name was Ms. Daisy. And she was in one of our small groups, and just a really lovely woman who taught me a lot about blues. And she was really, one of the more memorable people that was like, hey, I think you would like this. I think you would like this. And, like Mississippi Fred McDowell records and, any of the Piedmont blues stuff, all that. And then the other one was a gentleman named Walter, and he was a 6-string bass player, absolutely phenomenal. And he started giving me funk kind of stuff to listen to, which was pretty cool. And then lastly was a gentleman named Larry. Naturally, he was a very country-like guitar player, but just out of this world good. And they all just were in the adult band in this church. And I was also very much into punk at that time too. So the youth band didn't really know what to do to me. So I was very quickly ejected to go play with the adults because they didn't know what to do with me. So that's kind of my beginnings into music. I learned how to play piano first, as a young kid. And then in junior high, I played saxophone, and still I kept playing keys. But in 2000, a guy from church gave me my first guitar, which was a PV Predator, which is basically their super Strat. It's like a Strat basically from PV. And he was the one that kind of really, that really kind of got me playing guitar in general. But music for me has just been a whole lifetime of taking all that in. My favorite was Sunday and Saturday mornings when, we would listen to Oldies 104.3 before it was the Jack. And, they always had their classic country, segment on Sunday mornings. And I remember one of my favorite things was the first time I heard Willie Nelson, and that was on that show. And it was Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. And I remember hearing that and thinking that is the best song I've ever heard in my life.
Heck yeah. So I got wait a minute. I got to ask this question.
Okay.
How do you get from Mennonite gospel music to a Celtic punk band?
That was going to be my question.
There is a linear line there, but so basically how do I start with this? All that was a part of my life. And I had a friend at church. His name was Dave, and he lived in Crete, Monie, Illinois. And he was the one that kind of he started me on that. But I remember I'll let this person remain nameless, but at one point, somebody took me to a hardcore punk show in Joliet, Illinois, with some of the OGs of hardcore and punk, which was Madball and Agnostic Front. And so those guys are Lower East Side New York bands that in the 80s are responsible for running all the Nazis out of town and, all that kind of stuff. And so Dave was good friends, was already friends with the guys who I then eventually, after listening to Flatfoot and when they first started, and I probably met him in 2001, about a year after they started the band. And then eventually, I had a lot of really horrible stuff happen in the church that I grew up in that just happened to my family. And I left, and their dad was a pastor of a church. It was an Assemblies of God church, but it was kind of similar to what I was already in. It just was on a much smaller scale. So that's kind of how I ended up like being so close to them. I was a kind of a worship pastor in the church. And then I was like helping them write and I did a little bit of like pre-production and stuff with them. And, just like little bits of things here and there. And I started filling in for them when their original bagpipe and mandolin player was getting married and decided he wanted to step out. And so then myself and another guy stepped in, and I was playing guitar and mandolin and doing backup vocals. And then Eric was playing bagpipes. So that's kind of the line of how I got into that. But I've just always been a person who appreciates a lot of different music. And at that point in time, like I had a lot of really pent up anger that I didn't know what to do with. Like as I get older, I recognize in my younger self how angry I was. And I also recognize how, like with music, it's always been a very participatory thing for me. So like whether it was like worship music at church, or whether it was going to punk and hardcore shows and like being in the circle pit, or now like, being a part of this country scene here in Chicago, it's two-step, or like, I used to go swing dancing all the time, like when I was, in my early 20s. And, like all these like kinds of music were like ways for me to like both experience and love music and also express myself in a physical way too. So always been kind of a really interesting thing for me.